Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sticking it out to the very end. And I would like to start by thanking both Meredith and Daniela, my co-organizers of this event, and the speakers for their willingness to share their ideas and their research, and our kind moderators, breakout session leaders, the crack team, Jennifer and Sue, who have done so much to keep this going. And also just to acknowledge Kim Richter and Marcia Reed, who are our partners in the Trans-Pacific Project as well, and various others who have been giving us good advice on the sort of long-term trajectory of the Trans-Pacific Project, including Dana Leibson and Sophia Sanabray. So I just wanted to thank everyone. I also wanted to thank our partners in this endeavor, which is USC's Early Modern Studies Institute, and Peter Mancall, the distinguished director of the Institute, who this afternoon is serving as our escribano. It's our early modern scribe in the discussion. So I thought I would kick this off by a couple of general observations about, can we say, currents in disciplines in the recent years, and some observations and questions. And then I will be turning it over to Stephen Nelson of UCLA, who will also contribute observations and questions, Daniela and Meredith as well. One thing, as a scholar who spends time in anthropology and history, but who is an art historian, I am struck by the changes in the disciplines over the last 20 years or so. Because in anthropology 20 years ago, it would have been considered a very bad thing indeed to discuss objects, works of art, things, buildings, and so forth. Now, in the last 10 years or so, anthropologists and historians have embraced thing theory, dare I say it like drunken sailors. In the meanwhile, it's very interesting to see the changes in art history over this time. And I think some of the papers over the last 2 days would have been very at home in anthropology, history, or archaeology conferences. And so I'm struck by art historians looking more broadly at other sources of information. But one of my questions is, to what degree are we missing out on what we really do well? And so perhaps that's something we can pick up on later in the discussion. But I want to tug at a strand that was certainly brought up yesterday and a bit today, is on this idea of cosmopolitanisms. And the question about what is it to be cosmopolitan in the 17th century, in the early 18th century, at a time when most people lived very local lives. And what is their access to, can we call it original works of art? What is their access to these materials? How did they understand this? What can we say about the audiences for some of these objects in motion in the period that we're talking about here? So one of the things that maybe when they ask the idea of print culture here, what constitutes an original and how these ideas are exchanged, perhaps that's something that we can pick up. But I would like to turn it over to Stephen.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. First of all, I want to thank Joanne and Daniela and Meredith for inviting me, and I got the email, and I think I answered you within, 4.5 minutes or something?
Really
okay, sure, fine.
And really
and I feel like the interloper, all right, the sort of modern, contemporary, medieval interloper. And it's been really, really enriching, and thank you to all of the presenters. I mean, your papers were fantastic, and I've learned a lot. And
no, I knew you were going to get us into that.
and thank you to Peter, our scribe. He's fabulous, right? Right? Type that down. All right. Anyway, so but I guess what is very interesting for me is thinking about some of the larger issues that at least have come into my pea brain over the past couple of days. And the first for me, and this would be true whether or not we were talking about objects and people and texts and things in motion or not. And that's the issue of self-fashioning. And it encompasses, in a way, every single paper to a greater or lesser degree. Be it the bird of paradise, be it texts, Islamic texts about the New World, be it plates on walls and in houses in Swahili contexts, where in these cases, going outside of ourselves in order to bring in something that constructs us either individually or communally. And so, so we're coming from the very particular, these are the plates in my home, to the very grand, I have these paintings of Siam in my palace. And even though in these paintings, people are, the Siamese visitors are kneeling to the French, when they get to a Siamese, a palace in Siam, this no longer matters. It's about, the king of Siam and his production and construction of his home dominion at home. And so for me, the bottom line with self-fashioning and sort of constructing selves, be it national selves or individual selves, involves a number of different operations. And the big one for me, and it's something I started talking about yesterday, is translation. Because whenever we go out, and this is true of every single paper, that whenever we are sort of seeing things in motion, seeing things move, the first thing we try to do, and the travelogue is by far the preeminent example of this. We start to categorize and we start to put things into our own language. We start to put things into the ways in which we can understand them. All right? And what is so fascinating about that, and what some of the sort of tensions in a lot of the papers around that, which I love, is, whither the object, I think, for better or worse. What about the original? What's happening to the original? And some of the papers just didn't care about it so much, especially if it's something like a candle. And some of them cared about it a great deal. So what happens with an automaton when it's no longer an automaton? And I guess I was driven to sort of my own sort of preeminent text on the translator. I re-looked at Benjamin last night, Walter Benjamin's Task of the Translator. And my own, and I actually have to admit, I went back to my own dissertation, which I don't think I've opened up in about years. And I don't even want to know what Peter is writing. But what became really interesting to me is the sort of thinking about the relationship of the original thinking about the relationship of the original. Because on a certain level, we're worried about the original, and we're worried about sources. There's kind of a tyranny of the source that we have to contend with, I think. And what happens to that? And are we talking about parallel lives of things and objects and text? Are we talking about, with the one thing the four of us talked about over lunch, were afterlives, which Daniela hated, all right? Or is it that things have multiple lives, and these lives get spurred on through the act of translating it in from your language into my language? And in many ways, once, the sort of work of making something scrutable comes into play, when the work of making something commensurable comes into play, the original just may not matter anymore. And we may have to, as scholars or as artists or as critics, let go of it and understand that it's there. Or maybe the project is. And I was just sort of thinking through with this issue how one might fashion. And my favorite object right now to think this through is the bird of paradise. Because what you have there, and I think, Claudia, you did this just beautifully. You were talking about not only its sort of how it was shipped from point A to point B, and for those of you who didn't hear this paper, Claudia talked about the feet of the birds being chopped off when they were taken from one place to another. And then in their new place, the Dutch sort of making these tales about the birds that they never had feet and that they were always in flight. And then suddenly the bird shows up in another paper where it's, you're talking about it being in flight, but the image has it with feet in a tree. And so what if you took something like the bird of paradise from all of these different vantage points and all of the ways in which it has been talked about? What kind of an art history would you have? What kind of a a world, and I'm thinking of networks actually. What kind of a network would that create? And would it, and I think it strikes to the heart of what Joanne's talking about with the discipline and what do we bring to this as art history? What does art history bring to the table? But also, if we're really talking about method and we're really talking about historiography, if we're sort of focusing in a bit differently, what are the different kinds of stories that we tell? So is there suddenly a conference on the bird of paradise, and it's moving in different contexts, so in an Islamic context in the South Pacific, in the Netherlands, wherever it goes. Or of porcelain. You know, what happens when it goes to the Swahili coast? What happens when it's in England? What happens when it's in, and the missing piece for me, Canada, or the US, which in the 18th century is burgeoning, and a lot of the objects we've been talking about wind up in Salem, Massachusetts. And so I just, would love to think about those, and with that, I'm going to pass on to Daniela.
Thank you. I just realized that when we asked Peter to be the scribe,
Thank you,
we
Peter.
asked Peter to be the scribe, and we thought, he'll make this lively. And I forgot, this is someone who not only was on the Tonight Show, what is called The Daily Show? The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, but held his own, So he's totally going to upstage us. So we said we'd talk about 2 things each, but since I think Stephen did about 14, I'm going to do
Under
2 and
the
a half.
auspices of 2.
Because we also really want to open it up and to have this as a conversation, and that's part of the idea of having Peter write, so that we can use this as sort of a shared notepad to put everybody's voice there. And we were talking about evidence and records, right? And what do Africanists have to write with? What are the records about candles? And it'll be very interesting to see how the historical record corresponds or not to the lived experience of this. Should I wait until
We're just setting
the
up.
scribe is
immaterial
back on?
culture permits?
Text box.
Just start typing.
Oops, perfect. Those are some nails.
Yeah, those are some nails. Okay, so I think that I want to or bring up a theme that both Joanne and Stephen mentioned, which is about disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, and I want to pose it in the form of a question. I think many of you are familiar with the project that the British Museum did, The History of the World in 100 Objects. That was both it's both a book and also a series of podcasts. And what I've been thinking for the last 2 days is what happens if an art institution does 100 objects? What does it write? Does it write the history of the world? Does it write history? Does it write something else? So what does art history bring to object studies? Because if a discipline has been thinking for a long time and has a lot to say about objects, it is art history. And as sort of a hybrid historian / art historian myself, it was very interesting in the past 2 days to see how much art historians are sounding like cultural historians. And I feel, well, yes, you can do cultural history very well, but you can also do many things that cultural historians cannot, and those are dropping out. So I'm interested in bringing them back in and seeing what does art history as a discipline have to contribute specifically to this interdisciplinary conversation. That was my half point. Maybe I will limit myself to one. One topic that came up for me over and over, and I hope we can talk about, is that of distance. I think that distance as something that changes, that adds meanings, values, that came up whether in Claudia's very helpful Dutch phrase for what these people were after, which were basically things from far away, what the far away does, and the connection between far away and long ago, because it seems that distance in time was often in space, and motion in space was often connected to motion and distance in time, where it is making ancients of moderns, or relating moderns to ancients, or as in Avinoam's paper, doing a reflection or an edition of an earlier manuscript. So distance in time, distance in space, and the mechanisms for mastering distance or overcoming distance. I think we talked about objects in motion, but almost none of us talked about transport. And I wonder whether that's useful or not, what it would add to bring ships and mules and whatever it is into this story. I'm not convinced, by the way, I really mean it as a question. I'm not sure that it is helpful. And the last thing I'll say is that we talked about a lot of different things and types of things and movements. But I thought that we were still quite connected to the idea of art or visual culture as connected to representations and to whether two-dimensional or three-dimensional. And one of the things that kept coming up that I was seldom addressed was the idea of other elements of visual culture, performances, rituals, actions, the ways in which images and objects are activated through the lived experience, and sort of the evanescent or ephemeral nature of visual culture, something that I hope we can rescue or not forget as part of this conversation. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, thank you. I'll be really brief because I think we're all excited to hear from you and to discuss these issues together. And I just want to thank Stephen for agreeing to participate in 4.5 minutes in this roundtable discussion. It's been really wonderful to have your perspective, and my fellow co-organizers. This has been a really stimulating 2 days, and thank you all for sticking it out late on Friday afternoon. I just want to briefly...
Saturday.
Oh, right, exactly. I'm a little bit jet lagged.
No, it's been that captivating.
It has been that captivating. The time has just, In any event, I thought I would bring it back really briefly to a couple of the initial questions that Daniela and I raised in our introduction yesterday morning, Friday morning, because I was thinking about them and hearing the papers, and I was interested in the ways in which the different speakers addressed some of these issues that we brought up. So I'll just repeat a couple of these questions and then have us all think a little bit about what kinds of, maybe not answers, but suggestions, approaches have been provided. And the first is, what similarities and discontinuities does a comparative transregional approach provide? Moving beyond case studies, do we want to, I think I haven't written the rest of it out, but I would say it's something about how would a global narrative be possible or desirable? And I think that absolutely it's desirable. That was one of the kind of motivating... Well, I mean, I think initially we wanted to explore the idea that it would be desirable, and certainly in setting up this conference, we tried to provide a kind of approach towards a global narrative, or at least to put these different stories, these different geographic regions, temporalities, cultures into play. But I think, and yes, this is the no part of your, of the shift here, that I think in all of the papers, there's an interest in putting this narrative into play. At the same time, there's a real awareness of the limits of it. And I'm thinking specifically of Nancy's paper and what you were saying at the end about kind of the limits of Brodel and that approach towards thinking about the Indian Ocean and needing to take it on a port-by-port basis, or one could say a case-by-case basis. So I would really like to talk a little bit about that, about the limits of the global and that approach. And I would actually be interested in thinking about it from a pedagogical perspective. How do we teach this material? How do we take these different case studies and put them into some kind of, because if we are scholars, curators, we are telling stories in a way. That is what we are supposed to do, is to provide a narrative of some kind, to provide some kind of narrative flow and continuity, and as well as to be aware of discontinuity. So how do we do that? Do we want to do that? And if so, and also in terms of thinking about the introduction that we will at some point write, how is that possible, desirable, and how do we go about it? And then I guess very briefly, the second issue, we raised the question of the canon. Why have canonical buildings and objects stood outside of these narratives of global production and exchange? And I was just thinking about Stephen's wonderful example of the bird of paradise, and thinking back to Claudia's paper, and you showed a drawing of a bird of paradise by Rembrandt, yes? And if we did a conference, which I think is a wonderful idea, of the bird of paradise as it kind of migrates across time and space and culture, where does Rim...
Okay.
So where does, if we do that kind of conference, where does Rembrandt fit into this as an artist who I think is very much a member of the canon? I think we would all agree. Does it change our story of Rembrandt? Does it change our story of the canon? What are we doing here? What happens to art history in terms of this, in terms of these stories that we are trying to tell? So with that, I think we'd really like to open it up to the
and
audience.
These are our suggestions, but you know,
if you
whatever
also
you
have...
write will be misinterpreted up here.
No, translated.
Translated, yes. That's also what we think about that.
I wanted to see if our scribe wanted to remain mute and continue with his counter-narrative, or did you want to speak? All right, counter-narrative, right. Toss it out.
He's speaking. Yeah, the archive strikes back.
Yes.
When all three of you were asking about what can be our methodological models, right, for coming up with this, the book, and the Bird of Paradise was brought up, the book that immediately popped into my mind was Jansen's Apes and Ape Lore in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I mean, but it's interesting. It is a book that attempts to approach this object or this thing or this animal from a number of different angles, like Steve was suggesting. And then I started thinking about the Courtauld and the Warburg's institutes in the 60s and the 70s, and there were people like Otto Kurz who were there. Otto Kurz was attempting to write a global history of art, which he never completed. So I wonder if, as a discipline, as art historians, we might want to go back and look to that moment, potentially as a kind of guiding post, or kind of attempt to see, or how might we do it differently. But there was this moment, I think, where this was happening. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Thank you, first of all, everyone. This has been really an interesting conference, and I have to thank also my colleagues on the roster speaker. I think a lot of us made intrepid moves across the borders that normally define our fields, and that was sometimes scary, sometimes challenging, but I think it was fruitful. And about the global, I have to say, I think the global looks very different if you're standing in the metropole and if you're standing on the periphery, and we have to recognize that imbalance. So my question is not, should we have a global art history or not, but what kind of demands do we have in a global art history? Who needs a global art history, and who benefits from it, and who does not? I think that these are really key questions.
Do you want to suggest an answer?
Well, I mean, it's a funny thing because I used to be very kind of pro-global, global this, global that, and then I kind of, and I mean, now I'm kind of sitting in a different place, and I feel like, working on the Indian Ocean, my work is global in some ways, or it crosses boundaries implicitly, and so if global means adding a few African and Asian pieces to a Western canon, I don't know how much I need that, but but again, that's it's about where we stand, I think.
And I would add to that, from my point of view also, there's a problem with the term global and what is global. So for example, when we talk about Europe, we're basically talking often about Italy, France, England, maybe Spain in certain centuries, Holland in certain centuries. But we're certainly not talking about Croatia, we're not talking about Finland, we're not talking about Czechoslovakia very much, I mean, a little bit. But so that each one of, so what is global? Does it mean Europe is a monolith? Is then Asia a monolith? Or, how do we then decide what do we do with Canada? How do we decide? So,
it's a perennial problem.
I ask it as a
problem.
I ask it as a serious. I ask it very seriously because there's lots of wonderful art, but we look south, but we rarely look north.
So part of the issue here, I think, is whether national boundaries are the best way to talk about transregional art. And I think Gauvain's paper and a lot of his work is very useful this way. When you have French and German prints being used by German and Portuguese and Brazilian and Spanish American architects to do things that are very similar. They are locally inflected, but are they more similar or more different in multiple parts of the world at the same time? Then national categories are not useful, and but it's not global either, right? But it's there have to be other vehicles for talking about shared idioms, shared objects, than national categories.
Also, I think we tend to think of global. Does this work? Is this working?
Yeah.
You're working.
We tend to think of global as crossing an ocean. It doesn't have to cross an ocean, and it can be within what is now a country, but what wasn't then. And I'm writing Canada into my next book, by the way, just so we know what's happening with Canada. But I think we think of global in terms of going to quote-unquote exotic places across the sea. It doesn't have to be like that.
It's across LA.
It can be across, it can be across the street. I mean, it's how we, it's crossing from one comfort zone to another, how we reinvent ourselves as we go there, which we've seen a lot of, reinventing and reinterpreting what we see. But I think we've got to get away from this kind of fetish with oceans.
So I want to make a comment about the bird of paradise, and then I want to ask a question. And the comment about the bird of paradise is, first of all, I'm going to write something about it, okay, guys? So please, let me just finish something before. No, but what I found particularly, initially I wanted to write my entire paper about the bird of paradise because, as an object in motion, because starting with something like the Rembrandt drawing, which is a drawing that records specimens that he owned himself, we have a great case there of what is, for me, a real problem and a sort of base condition of the history of early modern European art, and Dutch art in particular, is that things from other parts of the world tend to be viewed according to a centrifugal model, right? Where they only count when they come into use, literally, by, for example, a Dutch painter. So the story of the bird of paradise falls away at the moment at which Rembrandt represents it. It becomes his possession and his drawing, right? And there isn't. So I found it really interesting to start. That wasn't how I got to the bird of paradise, but to think about that as a case of it is clearly an object in motion, not self-propelled motion, but motion of it, and how it changes. You could even say nature, but that's not true. But let's say how it changes significance as it moves from being an object of trade to being an object of Rembrandt's representation. And then how it changes, I thought, this was my initial question for the work on the Ottoman gift was, what are the Dutch doing giving birds of paradise to the Ottoman Sultan? I mean, he is, or the Ottoman Empire, the Levant, is the source of the exotics. So why do you give something that's exotic to?
And tulips
okay.
too, right?
And tulips too, yeah, but that I think was kind of a joke because they knew that they came from there. 3 decades earlier, and this class of merchants had arisen that was, anyway, but, okay. But I...
Write about the cheese.
Yes,
the cheese.
Okay.
But, yeah, but I want to, so I just want to say that for me, one of the things that was really gripping about thinking about objects in motion was how we tend, as art historians, European art historians at least, to think about objects as they come onto our radar screen, let's say, and then other elements of their histories or of their even formal qualities disappear from view somehow. So I want to ask a question of the organizers, and maybe Stephen too, and ask, what do you have in mind when you say objects? What do you have in mind when you say motion? I mean, I think it's really crucial to be specific about this. What kinds of vectors, what kinds of channels, what kinds of mobility are you talking about? And what do you mean by the early modern world?
Yes. Yeah.
So, sorry, I keep it simple.
Yeah. Well, that was part of, my original introductory comments, that we called these objects in motion in the early modern world, and we wanted to question every word in that phrase, except for the preposition and the article, right? Well, maybe in as well, I don't, but that there were open questions, and so we put it vague like that because I think they're deceptively transparent, but they're not, and so. We said objects, and we asked people to talk about objects, and I thought, okay, we'll see how many people talk about objects. I'm going to talk about a book that disappears, and then it's the reproductions of the book, and is that an object? So we wanted them to be open questions and generative categories, both, objects, motion, and world. And I think we started talking about global, about world, but the other two are also up for discussion.
Can I just quickly? So, do you feel afterwards that the object, let's say, that you talked about, is one of the objects you want? I mean, obviously, you want to keep talking about it, but is that an object, or is it information, knowledge, text? I mean, is text, as it's translated, an object?
Well, it was interesting how many of the papers were about working paper.
Yeah.
About prints, manuscripts, reproductions.
Commentaries on objects.
Commentaries on objects.
I think Govan made the point about prints as being sort of the quintessential objects in motion in terms of their circulation and the ways in which that media really was able to travel.
Well, I must say, after finishing the 4th year of a project that is supported also by the Getty here, that I'm involved in, the art space mobility, we are actually, for the last 3 years, confronted with these questions, and we are exercising actually global art on the field, because the whole project is about educating the new generation of PhD and postdoc students to think global and to see how it works. It's an exercise. We are not, trying to make out of it an ideology, but to see how it works when you come to work on it. We are traveling with different groups of international students to places which suggest the need of thinking global and see how it works. And I must say that we face a lot of problems. All these questions that you raise. I mean, first of all, case study comes immediately to mind. So there is only one case study, and you are looking at the case study. I think it's something that has to do a lot, the more I think about it, from the hegemony that the museum today takes in the question of global art. And no wonder that McGregor, with his book, became to be like the book now for global art. And it's so the museum and the object became to be, the arena or the field where we are looking at what is global art. And but he's very clever. I mean, had he been saying that only the history would be told with 100 objects, I would criticize him immediately because that's what each museum person in Berlin or in the Metropolitan would say. We are the global. We have the art in our rooms that shows the global art, but it's not. Global is about networking, and I think that's the key word. I mean, and that's what also McGregor is saying. Each object should be a kind of a network. I cannot read and speak at the same time, so I don't know.
Wait, and then go have dinner.
Okay. Okay, so it's the object that the network of the object that actually is interesting, and even if you think that a specific object is so local, it's amazing to see how global it is when you really go deep into it and you realize that there were some other vectors of power taking part in the creation of this work of art. So I think it's very welcome. Who benefit from it? What is it? It's all about politics. I mean, why we were interested in feminist art in the 60s, why we were interested in, I don't know, another stream in art history, be it even iconography at the beginning of the 20th century. It's about the politics, and the politics dictate to us also a specific stream of art history, and we are part of it, of course, and we are working within this ramification of our era. So I think we are exercising now something in art history, which is another possibility to look at art history. If it's good or not, we will see.
Frida.
I wanted to get to respond to your point about we need to get away from oceans. Of course, you could imagine that I would disagree with that. And I think one of the reasons oceans are good to think with is that they're fundamentally non-territorial spaces. And a non-territorial space allows you to I mean, of course, with politics, you'd layer that if you bring in politics. But nonetheless, what thinking through with oceans does is that it's a non-territorial place that allows you to trouble our assumptions that there is some inherent linkage or natural logic between people and places, or objects and places, that of course was naturalized in a certain way, and the notion of a national sense of belonging, that there is a natural link between us belonging to a place and the meaning that is produced in that place. And so the ocean unmoors us from those sort of ideas and makes us be aware of those ideas, at least. And another thing to get to your points about the global, I agree with Nancy in this regard. I used to be all about the global, but now I realize, of course, what has happened is that the global is, of course, the sort of like the story about the global and the local dynamic. In some ways, is a story about economic history, an attempt to use economic history, with peripheries and centers to tell the story of culture. And in some ways, therefore, you're always therefore telling a story of the localization of the global. You're actually naturalizing the periphery center dynamic to tell the story of art, to put it in one way. And one of the interesting things about in art history, or one of the issues that you raised, was this, what does art do, or what does art history do? And one of the things that I noticed in all of the papers, and certainly I feel it in my own work, is that we're, as art historians or scholars of specific fields, we're always worried about the original meaning. And the original, are we losing the original meaning of things? And certainly if you do tell a story of a global history, what happens is that there's a danger that you lose the story of the incommensurate, that which does not make sense. And so I think there's something and I certainly would not, as an Africanist, want to return to the story of the fetish, but, Peets did this beautiful piece on actually talking about that the notion of the fetish is actually the product of the encounter in the mercantile worlds of West Africa in the 16th, 17th century between between Europeans and Africans, and their misunderstanding of value. And so I think we want to bring into productive tension the notion of value, originality, and meaning, and why we put a particular emphasis on that objects can bring us closer to meaning somehow when we're all focused on motion.
But within that too, there's the whole issue of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself.
Yeah, no, exactly. So exactly,
Yeah.
Because of course the fetish is in some ways the completely misunderstood phenomenon.
And bad neighbors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about, in some ways abnormal traffic, right? Abnormal traffic, which in some ways we're all touching upon.
Sean,
yeah, so I actually kind of, I wanted to push back a little bit about the idea that I think we often pick up translation as an idea that will, as a rubric that's going to help us with talking about how things move around. And I think we often employ that in the sense that we have a sense of translation embodying within it a kind of incommensurability, a sense of difficulty, a kind of fraughtness and anxiety about influence. And it just occurs to me that notion of translation is not always a salient early modern one especially. And so that, that's a lot of that anxiety is that incommensurability is what we bring to translation. It often is not the way that the environments that we're often talking about and the people that inhabited them are often not thinking about translation in that way. So I'm not sure if that's nearly as profound as it sounded, as I wanted it to be when I began. But I just wonder about its utility when I think what we mean by it quite often is a certain kind of difficulty that we're hoping to bring back to the movement of things. And for me anyway, I don't think that translation has that, necessarily has that difficulty within it.
I totally agree with you. And where I think the difficulty lies is with the scholar, not with the actors or with the objects. It's with us. And and I think it's our fetish about the original. I don't think that many of the people we're talking about in whatever period give a rat's ass necessarily about the original or the copy or the stolen object or the re-gift. It's us. And I think as people who work on objects, or even more so pretty objects, that once it moves from point A to point B, it's our anxiety that within that operation, we have somehow lost the original. I don't think it's about the thing under scrutiny at all.
Anne.
I want to see if I can draw a couple of these threads together, but I'm not sure if I'm convinced with what I'm about to express. But I was thinking about this issue of books that come to mind. So we've heard Jansen. I was thinking of Raymond Williams' Key Words as a kind of gathering together. And then this, what you were just articulating, Stephen, about translation and original meaning. And what I start to worry about is that pursuit of the original meaning seems to me a bit akin to these grand narratives that we're questioning, because many of those grand narratives were a search for the original cause. Right. What made this, and with the idea that one could find that. And then I find we're on a slippery slope to the sort of great man theory of history. And so, I wonder if as a field, would it be healthy to live for a while in the kind of case study approach as we build up a new kind of corpus, while we're holding in mind a kind of suspicion around the grand narrative. So, is that a healthy place actually for us to exist? I'm thinking of the Art, Space, and Mobility project of kind of introducing this new generation to new ways of thinking. Do we need to have a larger community participating in these conversations? Is that where the field needs to live for a while?
Yeah, I just want to respond very quickly to this. I think that's very helpful. And I was looking at, thinking about this Stephen Greenblatt's Mobility Manifesto. And one of the things he says in the introduction to the book is that right now we need to do case studies and case studies and case studies to let the shared, not the grand narrative, but the shared aspects, the tensions emerge from those, so that we might be at that moment.
Andrew.
As someone who comes from very far outside this field, just the last comments and then some earlier ones, that anxiety about stepping out, about making connections, about stepping out of a kind of nominalism, or in this case, a sort of geographic nominalism, is really striking. And then the anxiety about speaking without documents, which take on the almost miraculous role that the object used to take in many of these talks, was really striking. So, I mean, many terms have been used for the process of objects in motion during the conference: translation, hybridity, metamorphosis, dissection.
Malleability and mutability.
So, to really think through those, preserving some of the local in this process and the specificity, though without needing to become an expert in each individual port, seems.
Right. Well, that's why we ask all these people who know about things that we don't know anything about to come and tell us their case studies.
Sophia.
One thing that I noticed that wasn't discussed in the conference relating to objects in motion were any kind of anything to do with the evangelization of the Americas, the Jesuits in Asia, and the types of objects that would have been either taken or crafted in one place, portable altarpieces, images of the Virgin from Spain taken to the New World. And what it got me thinking about, well, there were a few things that I thought about. One thing that struck me was the talk by Zirwat Chowdhury. When there was something she mentioned that didn't have anything to do with the tent, but she mentioned something that was called Chitra Darsha, the mutual gaze, talking about the devotion to a deity. And it really struck me that, because I work with colonial Latin America, I don't know anything about Indian art really. But in the image that she showed, there was a figure there with an image of the deity, and it struck me that there was actually a word for this, that there was a word for the mutual gaze, for devotion, and that relationship between the devout and the deity. And that was something to me that really struck me in thinking about the evangelization of the New World, devotional objects in Latin America. That just blew my mind, and I'm still thinking about that term, that there's a word for it, because I think it was really profound. And then what I was thinking about in terms of the kind of absence of the discussion of devotional images or those kind of things was, I think, in Petra's talk, when she mentioned for a moment ivory that was taken from Africa and then sent to Goa, that would then be carved into religious devotional images, and then sent around the Indian Ocean, got onto the Manila galleons, would go to the New World, or things that were crafted in Macau and Manila. And it got me thinking about raw materials, that to discuss objects in motion, things like ivory, things like emeralds from Colombia that were then prized in India, specific, if I'm thinking about shells, mother of pearl, or even porcelain. That while the raw, it's a finished product, but there's something that it almost takes on a different life in Brazil, or in Africa. When it's placed on, that the porcelain becomes, in a sense, naturalized and used as a raw material. Like a decorative thing. But it got me thinking about objects in motion, that the topic of the actual raw materials would be something that would be interesting. And then in a global context, that's where you could talk about things like ivory, being transformed into the virgin.
You could even make it more basic and talk about pigment. Color of pigment, and it traveling around, and what does that create?
Or you could have a year thinking about color, for example. Someone might. Yeah.
Gava, and then Jennifer?
Hi, I'm glad you brought up ivory, because I was going to bring us back around to a very interesting question someone brought up, I think it was Daniela, about let's not be embarrassed about being art historians, let's figure out what we can do that's different. And the reason ivory comes into it is that yesterday I was having a very interesting conversation with Dana about the problem of Asian ivories, that is, trade ivories with Christian subject matter. The problem being that, well, number one, it's one of the most important raw materials, one of the most important trade products, made in Goa, Fujian, Manila, shipped around the world, very big in Latin America as well as in Europe. Yet, we know almost nothing about provenance. We know very little from documents. And one of the problems is that most of the collections that exist now are created from the art market. So we have to use something that we can do, and dare I say it, visual analysis. And until I can think of a better way of coming to terms with these objects, I have to explain these, those of you who aren't familiar with them, they are so similar. And people don't know which ones were made in Fujian, which ones were made in Manila. They probably weren't made in Macau, although there's some debate about that. Then there are the ones in Goa that a lot of people are often mistaking for the ones from the Philippines. And outside of Asia, particularly outside Portugal and Spain, where they know a little bit more about them, they sometimes say they're German or French. I mean, they have no idea what they are. And we really need someone to sit down and do something really intelligent with this very important body of material that does cross oceans, that does cross continents.
I think this is really useful because it, I think, brings up the question of what art historians have to bring to this interdisciplinary conversation about objects, and that's visual expertise, a way of an expert eye, which is something that is very difficult and laborious to acquire, and that other fields don't have and need help with. But also the limits of that. I think that you're pointing out that style sometimes is very, very problematic as a diagnostic tool for location.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because just as your prints showed us, the ivories also show us that sometimes you look at something and you can tell it sort of looks like this, it sort of looks different from that, but it doesn't allow me to know where it's from. And this, I think, takes us back to something that we've been sort of circling around, which is geography. Because our discussion of local and global, of circulation, I was keeping a running list, of center and periphery, cursed words. But of networks. Networks is a term that has been coming up, and I'm interested in why art historians, I think, thought a lot about objects, and we have thing theory, and I think art history has a lot that it can contribute to thing theory.
Didn't we invent it?
Well, I mean, to the way that thing theory is being used now, that is very much not about an historical approach. But I don't know if there are similar models for thinking about place and circulation. And this idea of networks within the study of visual and material culture. I mean, I'm thinking about sort of the other world that I inhabit, which is the history of science, for which networks and circulation has been very important, and actor network theory, social studies of knowledge, those kind of models, Bruno Latour, these kinds of things have been very, very useful. And I'm wondering whether, we can name, just like we started to name, works that help us think about objects, and Nicholas Thomas came up, and Arjuna Padura is sort of like, he's floating around here, but the same thing we don't have, I think, for thinking about place and movements from place, networks. So I think that's one area where we need to dig deeper, because I feel like we're scrambling a bit. Then I feel like your hand shot up about this.
Look, Jennifer, I'm sorry.
I'm going to go next, actually, but I'm just going to throw in next to objects is the question of buildings. And all of your questions, I was going to say particularly what Stephen was saying about the more modern contemporary problems, is the writing of a global history of architecture. And that was certainly brought up by Zerwa, I think Prida, and particularly Nancy, in the kind of place versus non-place. So you have the kind of, Marc Auger kind of like theory residing in architecture now, or the question of, say, sovereignty in Agamben and taking on things like states of exception. And at least in architecture history, we're kind of moving beyond this question of, say, center and periphery or place and non-place, and we're moving towards systems. Systems of the South, systems of the global South. So this is including places like India, Southeast Asia, maybe Australia could also be in that mix, perhaps. But new ways of rethinking, non-linear ways of rethinking histories of architecture in parallel, so that modern architecture isn't simply canonical and based in Europe, but it's simply a parallel series of histories that run together.
Dana, you.
I had a couple of thoughts. I'm not sure if either of them will be very smart, but we'll give it a try. One of the things that occurred to me with this network idea and systems and these kind of more horizontal as well as vertical connections, I think that's what one thing that networks allows us to talk about, in my mind kind of circles back to something that was raised at the beginning of the conversation, which is cosmopolitanism. Because I think cosmopolitanism is nothing if it's not a series of networks. And the question, it's a particular kind of network, and networking, however that might go. But I think that might be an interesting way for us to think about both what do we mean by cosmopolitanism and what do we mean by networks. And then pressing a little harder on this question of what can art history do, one thing I'm wondering is, not to be impertinent, but we're getting near the drinking hour, is why do we care so much about what art history can do and I mean it really quite seriously. I mean, what is the issue with art history? But presuming we do care, I worry a little bit that we think that art historians and art history, the strengths of the field are limited to what we can see, the material world. And I would kind of make the argument that one of the things art history can do is challenge theories that come from outside, whether it's economic history, world history, global history, social history, literary history, and help all of us think more interestingly about the limits of those theories. So for instance, in the case of cosmopolitanism, I think of that as being really a theory about choices and who can move and who can't move and what kinds of boundaries are worth moving across. And I think art historians might have some very interesting things to say about that people who don't work on objects might be able to then profitably work from. So I would make the argument that art history could also be theoretically generative and not just generative primarily around objects and things.
I agree.
Abhinav, did you want to? Yeah.
Well, I must say I don't want to steer the water here, but I feel like I must. You know, we are talking about objects. We are talking about the problematic of placing them and finding. I mean, like the ivories that Gavin was talking about. I must say I like this object that we cannot space. I like them. I think these are the most wonderful object for art historian to start to think about the methodological approach that we are taking as art historians, because who cares about where the object was born? I mean, Daniela, what is important is your birthday in your case of biography, or what is the case of an object? Is it really its date of time? Are we working for the auction market now? We are art historian, I'm sorry. We are working actually to see the many levels of interpretation and histories of one object. So free ourselves from this thing. I'm not saying that we don't have to look at case studies, we don't have to look back to the object, but for God's sake, I mean, we are not going to look only for the originary and the original on the authentic history of the object in the way it was born. I mean, we have many other things to do. So here I am steering water, and again, against the methodological approach that is hovering above us, the museum with its labeling of object. But so we have to insert new ideas even to the museum today. And why the museum? I'm sorry, I mean, all the world is traveling from one museum to other museum. Look what's going on in all the big cities of the world. I mean, tourists are just rushing from one museum to another. It's their place where they get the narrative. They don't, I don't think they read one of the books that we produce here.
And don't forget biennials.
And Zerwan had, and then Chantal, and Stephen. Oh, gosh. So Zerwan, I think.
I was just going to actually follow up on Stephen's point earlier. You mentioned that you reread Benjamin last night on translation, and I was thinking with regards to, I think, Meredith's comment about, we were trying to tell stories, and Benjamin's storyteller is also, I think, really instructive, I think, for the kind of work we're doing, not just in terms of, we can suddenly move away from narratives, but also the fact that the kind of work we're trying to do with global history allows us to produce work that can be open to reception by other scholars who will continue that work, one would hope. So I think in that way, it's nice to have this prospect of not having to close the window on these things that we're working on. But the other thing is that, yes, to some extent, I do agree with you, Stephen, that there is, we do project a lot of these anxieties about the original meaning and translation, or the lack of commensurability onto these early modern objects. But some of the, what's interesting about reading some of the sources from this period is that there is also a lot of anxiety about the lack of commensurability, and that, for example, writing about translation is one of the ways that a lot of agents during this period, cultural agents during this period, are trying to address that. So I think what's also interesting is the way in which on the one hand, there are these networks, but on the other, these networks are also being created and rippled by virtue of the frictions and stoppages within those networks. So, I mean, I remember Claudia was asking Nancy something about, what there are these ship inventories where the number of goods that arrive are never matched by the actual numbers indicated in the inventory. And of course, one of the reasons why there's, at least in the English case, why there's not a matchup is because you list an object, you have to pay taxes on it. And so there are these kind of, interesting unevenness within these networks as well. I think that's also very important for us to remember so that we don't get very carried away with this idea of things moving so freely. But that's all.
Right.
Stephen.
I'm also very interested in objects that are misunderstood and also objects that are forgotten. And I think one thing we need to bear in mind is those objects or commodities that move around the globe, either by sea or by land, and that very often, depending on their value and how the value is construed, those objects are valued and made known by those in power or who are powered either politically or economically, but there also are audiences who are not empowered politically and economically who might have a great interest in objects that are not favored by, say, an establishment. And a really good example of that, if I remember correctly, and Mary Sheriff's talk raised this issue in my mind, when Cook came to the Pacific and was killed in Hawaii, his ships went back to England, and the Admiralty, which had charged him with his 3 journeys to the Pacific, were interested in all kinds of things except the artifacts he had collected. So they were interested, and they confiscated immediately when the ships tied up on the Thames, all the charts, all the diaries. You were forbidden to take a diary off the ship. You had to give that up. Things of information that was of strategic importance, and so on. And hundreds of artifacts came off those 2 ships, and on the docks were art dealers who had galleries, believe it or not, in the 1790s in St. James and Mayfair that specialized in artifacts from the Americas, from Africa, and this new realm, new to Europe, or relatively new of the Pacific. And the establishment wasn't interested. The establishment forgot instantly about those things, but there were collectors of them. And the amazing thing in that case of those 2 ships is that one of the early anthropologists of the day was a Professor Blumenbach at Göttingen University in Lower Saxony, which had been founded by George III's grandfather. George III was King of England when the ships came back, and this poor Professor Blumenbach wrote a letter in English to George III, since Lower Saxony was under the domain of the English, at least of the House of Hanover. So a great compliment in Hanover at that time was, "Oh, you speak really good English," because your king was over in London. And George III hired an art dealer to go out and buy 300 artifacts from all of these dealers, as long as they were documented as coming from Cook's voyages. And George III sent them all as a gift to Göttingen, and they've been there since 1782, pristine, and forgotten by almost everyone except a handful of anthropologists. And I had an interesting experience with this group of objects because when I was director of an art museum in Honolulu, I discovered by chance from a German graphic designer that this collection existed, and we brought the entire collection back to the Pacific for the first time since 1779. And the most interesting about that, although it was a complex project fraught with all kinds of challenges, was how to deal with the sacred objects, how to deal with the sacred icons that were sacred to the native Hawaiians, especially. And the collection included things from Aotearoa, known in some circles as New Zealand, Tahiti, the Marquesas, the Aleutian Islands, Tierra del Fuego, and Hawaii, and Fiji. But it was really interesting how these artifacts were perceived so differently in Hawaii. And then the show went to Canberra, where there the show was all about Cook, who is considered almost a god in Australia. Whereas the Hawaiians were so proud to have killed him, the Tahitians tried very hard and failed. But it was really, it was like navigating a ship next to a reef, to borrow a nautical thing, in terms of how do we present an image of a sacred god, sacred to Native Hawaiians when there's a revival of Native Hawaiian religion going on in Hawaii. And particularly in a context when many people in Hawaii view Hawaii as a colony of America today. Yeah. So that was interesting. The other point I want to make, and this is just a remark about the conference generally, which I've learned so much from, and I'm so delighted to have been invited to be part of this. I'm working on a project right now, an exhibition that will open at LACMA exactly a year from today, on May 11th of next year, on the history of collecting Chinese paintings in Japan over 600 years. And that's also an interesting project because we are bringing paintings here kinds of painting which have been largely forgotten in China, which were revered in Japan. We're bringing in, and I'm part of my goal in the show is to ask the question: how does one culture appropriate something from another culture, make it a national treasure, and yet that object is forgotten in its native country? That's one of many questions we're dealing with, but I've been wanting to do the show since the 80s. LACMA is the first place I've actually gotten an approval to do it, so I'm really thrilled to be here in LA. The show is not traveling anywhere because of the difficulty in borrowing a national treasure from Japan, even when it's Chinese.
And you'll invite us all to the opening, right?
Yes. And if we get funding, we'll have a symposium.
I was going to say, Shoshan has been very patient.
Thank you. As I'm hearing these comments about interdisciplinarity, which I think are all very productive, it occurs to me that we shouldn't miss the opportunity to actually examine the discipline a little bit more and the dialogue between subdisciplines and subfields. And I don't think those are mutually exclusive, of course, but one thing that I think has been really productive about this conference is that it has brought together people from different subfields. But I wonder if there's a way in which we can intensify the conversation by looking at a field, say like Islamic, which of course is my first home, and thinking about how that field has dealt with the question of networks and appropriation across time and space. So you have these subfields, which because of the way they were conceived of as these vast geographical zones comprising thousands, of years that have actually been dealing with these questions of kind of cross-cultural encounter for quite some time. So I think that in addition to thinking about how art history, anthropology, history, archaeology can all speak to each other, I think we should actually really build on the conversation we've begun about kind of conversation we can have between Africanists, Islamicists, and certainly we shouldn't be limited by those distinctions, but we also shouldn't kind of gloss over them as we continue as well.
I just want to thank everyone. It was such a great conference, so thought-provoking. And in this roundtable, I've been really thinking about where the disciplines come from, where it's going. And I just wanted to point to three things. To Jessica Keating's comment about the 50s and 60s as a moment, I would also maybe propose going earlier to the 20s and 30s, when art history was thinking about telling a global history, and it was in dialogue with anthropology, with psychology, evolutionary psychology, and that it's been a historiographic moment that's been written out because it leads to a relatively virulent strand of nationalism that we may want to forget, but that there might be a methodological promise in revisiting that moment. So that's one. In terms of violence, I feel like we've been talking about one of the most violent periods in history, and yet violence, gender, power, sexuality, race haven't come up that often.
Power was everywhere.
Well, in a certain way, power was everywhere, although it was usually about reifying a political power that was already in place. The cosmopolitanism was speaking to a mobilization of networks for a certain class of people that controlled it. And exploitation in that process wasn't always discussed. We could debate this. Maybe it was not told in a different way. So anyways, that's, in terms of where we've come from, I feel like the cultural turn is something we might not want to forget in moving forward in the global turn. Slavery, yeah, sure. And then the one last...
Labor and Potosi, yeah.
Yeah, the one last thing was when Dana was talking about generative possibilities for art history. As a young scholar, one of the things that seems so exciting about globalism is that it seems like a moment when art history might be able to produce its own methodology once again. Because for a long time now, we've been looking to other disciplines and appropriating, making slight revisions, tweaks, showing incommensurabilities. But it seems like there's a very rich potential for something to emerge from within art history. And I don't know what that is, but I would push towards that rather than pulling from outside of it.
As someone who works in Greco-Roman antiquity, and I'm not an art historian, I speak with a certain trepidation, but one of the things that interests me about the conversations at this conference is that the term motion, objects in motion, and motion seems to include two different classes of objects. Objects which are physically transported, and objects which are transmitted through media, in particular print media. And some of the papers have drawn connections between those two forms of objects, but it seems to have remained somewhat theoretically under-thematized. And I think this is important because the relationship between physically transported objects and objects transmitted through media is not a static one. So in our contemporary society, that distinction is not present in the same way in a world where you can download the design for a gun and print it up on a 3D printer. You know, that's...
Last week, yeah.
Yeah, this is a distinction which is becoming obsolete. And if you look to the ancient world, when you're talking about a copy, you're often talking about a copy in the same media. Yeah. So Roman sculptors making a copy of a statue by Praxiteles. And I think that what I would like to hear from art historians working on the early modern period is precisely how does print culture change the very meaning of what original is? Does it create a shift to identifying the original with a physical object in its raw materiality? Is copy very much seen in terms of what is mediated? And so I think this is a way that art historians could enlighten the rest of us. And as somebody who works in the ancient world, and I see Peter's been writing this all the time, you really could learn a lot from the archaeologists.
Okay.
Thank you, Ray. I think it's a good point. Did you want to respond, or no? No? Okay. But,
and I would like to see that vis-a-vis the growth in mass production as well. I think at a certain point in the 17th and 18th century, they start to go hand in hand.
Well,
so
one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking that I was reflecting on is, I think as some of you know, next year we're going to be meeting in Manila, and we're moving to a later period. And then the final element of this series will be in Sydney for the most modern period. But you're reminding me that maybe we should have gone back in time, and then look at Pacific interactions in earlier periods. And I was thinking back to what Andrew said. There is a tyranny of text, and I can say as somebody who works on a culture without text, it's liberating. But I mean, it forces you to focus on other things. And so I think your point about looking at allied methodologies would be very interesting.
Can I just say that it's very interesting? First of all, you should take all of us to Manila. I want that in the proceedings. Okay. Okay.
Talk to the banker there.
It's up there. Yeah. But it's interesting that we're thinking a lot about movement. What does that mean? How do objects change? How are they reproduced? How are they changed? Geography, place, media. But we're thinking still in terms of periods. And you're like, okay, we're doing early modern, and then we're doing 18th and 19th, and then we're doing 20th, and we should go back in time. And, if we are at as Dana said, the next thing is the drink. So if we're at that stage of the conference, what happens if we had not invited 12 people who work in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century in different parts of the world, but if we had done it, longitudinally rather than transversally, how different ways there are to cut this cake.
Well, we came up with 2 words at lunch. Actually, the 4 of us ate lunch together. We were
I
plotting
forgot,
against
really?
all of you. And the 2 words, we were thinking of papers from this morning, and the 2 words were infinite rococo.
Oh, right.
And
That's-
because
yeah.
we were talking about how rococo objects and architectures had gone back from Brazil to Africa in the 19th and 20th century, and that churches that we were seeing yesterday look like mosques in Lagos, Nigeria, and there are these houses called Brazilian houses in Lagos, Nigeria, made from returned slaves that are resistance to the British colonizers.
I want to say that Meredith is writing that book.
Yeah, Meredith's writing Infinite
She
Rococo.
volunteered to write
But we were
Rococo.
thinking about sort of the movement of objects, not just across geographic boundaries, but also chronologically. And that time is actually this thing that is so interesting here as well. That certain forms just sort of stay, and they stay with us, and everything in the Rococo, everything from architecture to quinceaneras to, whatnot. And
It's now you're going
it's
to get into the
fascinating.
shape of time and form.
No, because I don't think we have any prime objects in there.
Are you bringing this to a close?
I think our scribe is telling us that it's time to withdraw to the bar. But before we do so, I wanted to thank Peter, USC, the Early Modern Studies Institute, and our outstanding scribe. I would also like to thank Amy Braden from USC, who did a terrific job organizing this. And then I also want to signal a couple of people who have been working on this for 1.5 years, along with Daniela and Meredith and me. And that's Jen Schmidt, Sue Kang, and also Rebecca Peabody, who heads up our research project program. So I want to thank all of them, our fantastic AV team, our events team, thank all the speakers, the moderators, discussant, breakout leaders, web team, yes, and Michelle, Michelle Fahey.
I was saying yesterday that this looked like a conference, but it also felt like staging an invasion. And yes, I was thinking that's very early modern of me to be thinking in sort of colonial terms. But then I was thinking about the Mars landing, and if we, all this team and all this energy, all this brain power, we could have landed a spacecraft in another planet or something with the effort that went into this.
I want to thank the audience, because I've rarely been to a conference, and we were saying this also at lunch, where people have been so engaged and so smart. And
Good questions.
And wonderful questions, and this kind of specificity that's being paid to the terminologies that it's been really productive in terms of thinking about this as this project moves forward. But I just really, really appreciate all of the questions, and I would invite you all to play your own role as scribes, and if you'd like to send us thoughts that you have about objects, about motion, about early modern, we would be really grateful. But thank you so much for everything that you've brought to this conference.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Please join us for a reception.